So we're going to talk about troubleshooting. Part of that is just a very brief overview of IPsec itself. IPsec is, as you all know, I'm sure, is a way of doing site-to-site data center connections between partners who are not one organization, or there's not a complete trust profile. So you want to set in place, number one, you want to have encryption over the internet. And then you also want to set in place policies that limits what you will show from your network and limits what you will see from their network. This is done, two key elements of it is the first part of the communication, which is called Internet Key Exchange, is done over UDP 500, UDP port 500. So obviously that has an impact on your security groups, and we went over security group best practice at the last session. And then depending upon whether you're going to use what's called Nat Traversal, which means that one or more of the IPsec devices appears to be behind a gateway. It's not an internet edge device. You then would use what's called Nat Traversal, and that is basically the IPsec protocol encapsulated inside of UDP port 4500. Or you could be using native IPsec, which is its own protocol. So it's not port 50, it's protocol 50. The name of the protocol is ESP. So ESP sits on top of the IP stack, so it's comparable to TCP or UDP. It's its own protocol, ESP. So IPsec with VNS cubed, here's some high-level things. We do what's called a policy-based VPN. And that effectively is what I just spoke about, which is that you offer something from your network, so a subnet or set of subnets, and then you ask for something. So you're wanting one or more subnets from the customer, from the other side, and by defining that set of to-from relationships, you're implicitly putting in place firewall policies and routing policies to connect those two subnets together. And again, in the case of policy-based VPN, it's done implicitly by when you say new tunnel on the VNS Cube device, and you put in that from to pair, what's happening is you're creating effectively a firewall policy and a routing policy all in one. It's becoming very popular. Some of the devices are now supporting what's called a route-based VPN. And effectively, that's opening up the two networks to each other such that anything from anywhere to anywhere can flow. What that does is it makes it easier to get the basic connection up and running because there's no constraints. It just I'll accept any traffic from your network and I'll send any traffic to your network. But then it requires explicit creation of then some routing policies and some firewall policies. We already mentioned ESP. ESP is the protocol. There is a way of doing IPsec with what's called authentication header, AH. It's effectively not used. It's not secure, and we don't support it. Same thing with tunnel mode versus transport mode. We use tunnel mode. Transport mode is not as secure, and we don't support that. IKE we already talked about. That's what's commonly used for phase one setup. There really isn't there isn't much else done. Then there's a mode called main mode versus aggressive mode. Again, from sort of earlier days of IPsec, there's a mode called aggressive mode. All it does is it does the initial communication, sort of that phase one communication more quickly. We're talking something that takes, milliseconds to do anyway. But in aggressive mode, again, less secure. So we don't support that. And then you can authenticate between the two devices using a pre-shared key, effectively a shared password, or you can use X509 certificates. Using certificates for authentication between the devices generally works between vendors of the same style. Generally is hard to make work from an interoperability point of view. So for interoperability, what you'll find is everyone uses PSK still, and we don't support certificates. So we don't do route-based. We don't use authentication header. We use tunnel mode. We don't use transport mode. We use main mode. We don't use aggressive mode. And we don't use certificates. We use pre-shared key. For those of you who've worked on a number of these tunnels, a request for authentication header or transport mode or aggressive mode, I'd be surprised if you've had more than one or two of those requests because they're just not common. They're sort of part of the legacy of IPsec.